to either of you because you're going to speak for them yourselves. But I really appreciate you coming and sharing today. And I think as an organisation, we can't ever be too careful about how much we ask of the people we want to walk alongside. And sometimes, like today, it feels more respectful to ask experts who are working on the front line to share with us a little sliver of what you know. And we're relying on George and Kon to share information and stories we all need to hear, but in a safe environment. Kon and George, as I've said, are giants in our world, and they're good friends of Igniting Change. And I pulled in a favour and I asked Kon to interview George on behalf of Igniting Change. And please, I'd love you to welcome Kon and George. And again, thank you so much. It really, I just love being in your presence, always, both of you.
When we kick things off, I also want to acknowledge that we're gathering on the land of the Wurundjeri and the Wurrung people, the Kulin Nation, and pay our respects to elders both past and present. I'm going to begin the morning in conversation with George for about 40 minutes, really trying to unpack how important and vital that the work he's doing. I want to say a huge thank you to Jane and the whole Igniting Change team who for decades have been championing spaces where critical work being done by people like George get a platform that they otherwise would not. And a lot of people would miss out on the opportunity to support such incredible work. So thank you for being here. And a big thank you to Jane and Igniting Change. George, let's get right into it and make the most of this time. What happens to the people you represent? You champion refugees, First Nations, women, prisoners, people that are victims of incarceration, people who are brutalized in systems that aren't there to rehabilitate and protect them. What happens to the people that you fight for if people like you and your team in the amazing National Justice Project aren't there? What's the human cost and consequence?
That's a really interesting question, Con, and totally off script, so thanks. But look, the human cost is this. We get calls. I get calls on the weekend. I don't know whether you know, you saw in Victoria that a 16-year-old boy, an Aboriginal boy, was run over by a police car on the weekend in New South Wales. We're at the front line of those kind of calls and those urgent cases. But at a deeper level, so we're there as first responders, but at a deeper level, we are doing work that just isn't available or accessible to members of the community. If it wasn't for the work, and I'm not taking away work from others and the important work that you do.
Let's start with something. It's a given. George always works in a way with our sector, with the movement, doesn't duplicate, finds the gaps. That's a given. So let's not worry about that.
Okay.
I really want to spotlight your work is life and death work. What is it about what you do and your team does that saves lives, that changes things?
Okay. Well, if you take the kids on the route, this is one where Con and I worked really closely, and I can't thank the ASRC enough. And I know that you said it's not about that, but really we couldn't have done it without the social work. I had lawyers in tears at 10 o'clock at night because families and children were at serious risk of death on the route. And Connor understood that and really backed us. He had a team of social workers that was taking that.
But I want to paint a picture. I'm going to cut you off there. I'm coming back to you, George. Let me paint the scene. And apologies for, I'll try not to be too graphic. Let me paint the scene. 7-year-old children that have stopped eating. 8-year-olds that are self-harming. How does that even capture, how does that even exist in the imagination of a beautiful little child? 9-year-olds that have become nude. Mothers on the phone going, my little baby's going to die. They're not talking, they're not moving, they're not eating. Save us, please. That's
and
what
that is the background.
Yeah, so go.
And as lawyers, we're not trained to deal with that. And I'm not going to go on about you. Let me finish. We had to come up with a novel way of helping those kids. Everyone had tried going to the High Court, challenging the constitutional legality of sending kids to Nauru. Everyone had given up on legal avenues for a response to the crisis that was on Nauru. But when we saw those children who were suffering in the way that Con has just explained, we came up with a novel strategy. If you read the High Court cases, it's called M61, where the High Court validated the Australian government's constitutional right to send people to Nauru. There were little crumbs in there about the Australian government still having a responsibility. Okay, you can send them there, it's legal, but that doesn't get you off the hook. And we followed those crumbs and we said, look, a lot of human rights lawyers don't get down and dirty with what we are basically doing is using tort law, which is ambulance chasing law. People have kind of frown on ambulance chasing lawyers, but we were forced to use that law to save lives. So when Kon says, what's the importance of your work? We strategized, we came up with a legal theory that was novel, that would change the way these individuals are being treated.
And what this is the precious thing, what was the outcome of your advocacy and legal intervention meant what in the end?
So it meant two things. Immediately, we were getting those kids off Nauru. Judges were saying, you cannot allow this child to die because they were heading in a downward direction very fast. And all the psychiatrists and medical experts were saying that if you don't do something, this child could die. And that's kind of our area of expertise. We bring in experts from a range of fields, apply novel areas of law, and we've got judges to order these kids off. But it had a greater impact. We shared our IP, and one case became 50 cases. And then you got some momentum. The AMA, the Australian Medical Association, World Vision, ASRC, and very important organisations got behind the push for the Medevac laws. And we were fortunate that there was a by-election and Medevac laws were able to get through.
Let me set the scene for the Medevac laws, and then what George did. So thinking about this, George, you're doing beautifully. I just want to miss the critical part you're playing because you're too humble. Within this space, when we're talking about a Medevac law, what we're talking about are people that came seeking asylum 9 years ago, forced to get onto a leaky boat as the only way to escape places like Afghanistan, Syria, Myanmar. Upon arriving here, we put them in some of the poorest countries on earth, Papua New Guinea and Nauru. And you would be on the phone with these men saying, I'm losing my sight. I think I'm having a heart attack. I've been talking to men on the phone, having a heart attack in real time. I've got heart disease, I've got glaucoma. I need medicine for my blood pressure, my heart, my mental health, and getting no medical care. I went there and saw it myself. I paid a people smuggler back in 2017 and went to Manus Island to see. And the horror of watching us cage these people like animals and leave them to perish. So this was life and death again, and yet again, strategic advocacy, law reform, test cases. What did you achieve through that work?
Well, ultimately, not only did we get we started getting individuals off one by one, and then that became a bit of a cascade, a bit of a waterfall, and then ultimately, through the political avenues, amplifying the advocacy based around the casework, there was law reform. There was a change in the law that said doctors should decide who comes to Australia for medical care, not politicians, not bureaucrats, but medical professionals. And that's what happened. There was a panel of 9 medical experts set up, including government-appointed doctors, and they decided who came to Australia for medical treatment. But if it wasn't for that hard work, they'd still be rotting or possibly dead on Nauru and Manus. And just on that point, we are also acting for, there are 12 deaths offshore during the time that Australia transferred detainees offshore. We're acting for the large majority of them, and we are using inquests to expose what's happening on those islands and force change, and getting coroners to make recommendations that hopefully governments will pick up.
I remember calling the wife of one of the men that had died that you had helped just to give our condolences. So about 4 days later, only to find out, because she was here she was in another country, hoping that she could be reunited. And when we rang, we found out we were breaking the news to her, that the Australian government didn't even think to tell her that her husband had died in their care. Let's talk about your critical work using the power of your lawyers to do strategic litigation, advocacy, law reform and test cases. you really focus on this critical space of immigration detention centres, prisons,
yes.
youth justice places. Like in Northern Territory, 100% of people there are Indigenous, 500 deaths in custody since 1991. Talk to us about why you focus on detention, prisons, what work you do, what test cases you're running, what critical impact you're having.
Okay, let me pull the strings of that together. We have built on the work that we've done on Nauru and Manus for the asylum seekers, particularly those in detention. We've taken the expertise and development of that new law in terms of duty of care and applied it not just to offshore detention but onshore. As Kon will tell you, the poor medical treatment of people on Nauru and Manus is mirrored here in Australia, MITA and BITA, and in the immigration detention centres around the country. And I've been involved in these cases since Cornelia Rao and Vivian Salon, which is 15 years ago now. They were in immigration detention. They should not have been there, and they both had health problems, both Cornelia and Vivian. And our system is full of people with health problems that should not be in detention, either in immigration detention or in prisons. Our prisons are full of people who should have been diverted into healthcare. And if you look at the youth justice system, 30 years ago, the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody said one of the principal recommendations was to divert people away from the criminal justice system. Don't criminalise their disability. Don't criminalise their health problems. But the fastest growing cohort in our prison system at the moment is Aboriginal women. And most of them have some kind of intellectual or health problem, an intellectual disability or health problem. And what you're seeing is jails being filled with people who should be receiving proper health care. We don't provide it, and they end up in jail. But to take Kon's point, we've taken the experience that we learned in helping the kids on the road, and we now apply it to kids in youth detention. We're running a case for 2 Aboriginal children in Western Australia, actually one Aboriginal and one Maori, who were locked up for a year in solitary confinement. Can you imagine how that child comes out of detention? They needed love, they needed compassion, they came out brutalised. They'll come out and they've now, at least one of them has graduated to an adult prison, but has told us they have more rights in adult prison than they did in youth detention. They felt abandoned, locked up 23 hours. These are the conditions that mostly Aboriginal children are being kept in Northern Territory and Western Australia, locked up 23 hours a day. Some locked up in isolation. It's creating a group of children who will be permanently incarcerated.
Let's talk about how young they could be. Talk about speedhood.
Yes.
Talk about, I think a lot of people don't have any idea how young we're talking and the conditions. Share a little bit more about it.
I don't know whether you know, but we're part of this Raise the Age campaign. It's a national campaign at the moment. Children as young as 10 are being kept in these conditions. 10. A 10-year-old should not be in prison. They should be kept, if they do have a problem, a mental health or some kind of psychological problem, they should be kept in a healthcare situation, which is about compassion. It's supposed to be about compassion and treatment rather than punishment. Punishment of a 10-year-old will end up with that child being broken for the rest of their lives. So why is it that Australia is one of the few countries in the world that have not got a standard age of 14? That's what we're arguing for. Up until 14, a child should not be in prison. It's a big campaign going on at the moment, and if you haven't seen it, please get behind it and just Google Raise the Age and you can get behind it. What was the other question?
The conditions like speedhood. You've talked about the solitary confinement, just some of the other conditions that children are being subjected to that in any other setting would be child abuse. Help the audience understand again the importance of why you're in these prisons, running these test cases, defending predominantly First Nations children, Aboriginal women who make up 1 in 3 people in women prisons, despite being 3% of the population. Talk about it.
So we do get some wins I want to just talk quickly about Spithoods. There's a case that we're involved with. We're acting for the mother of an Aboriginal man who died in Yatala prison in South Australia. And one of the outcomes of that family's advocacy, and we stand behind them, is for the banning of Spithoods in South Australia. Their loved one died with a spithood on his head and in the back of a van. None of the guards will tell the coroner or anyone what happened in that van. We do not know to this day, after a 2-year inquest, what happened. They're claiming a right to silence, and nobody knows what happens. But one positive thing, and the coroner still hasn't made a finding in that case, but one positive thing that has come out of it is the banning of Spithoods. But you have children as young as 10 being chained to chairs with Spithoods on their heads. I mean, you've probably all seen that image of Don Dale. And that, it's a form of torture. You could not, if you did that to your child, you would be arrested and charged with a criminal offence. But that is legal.
Can I just ask what actually Spithoods do? I've seen it, but I just know what's the
So the guards claim that they are at risk of, you know, HIV or an infection if someone spits at them. Now, there are alternatives. We've all seen the plastic shields that people wear with PPE at the moment, and guards can actually wear those. But it's inconvenient for them, and they prefer to punish the victim by tying their head up. Now, if you've got claustrophobia, if you've got anxiety, which a lot of these children have, imagine being chained to a chair with a spithood on your head, because you can't see anything. And look, I don't want to get into the gruesome details, but it is torture, and there's no reason for it. The guards can protect themselves with PPE.
So, George, let's summarise so far our journey here. Through your work, more than 1,100 women and children got off from the roof to safety, saving children's lives. Through a critical part of your work, yes, with us, but a critical role, more than 200 people got medically evacuated with serious health conditions that could have died, could have many more deaths offshore. Through your work, you're fighting to raise the age, get reform around how First Nations people are being treated in prisons. Talk to me a bit more about either test cases you're running at the moment or ones that you're most proud of that show the power and impact of what you do.
Well, I'd like to talk about Miss Do, but before I do, the situation of the Spithoods just reminds me of another case that we're involved in. I don't know whether you've heard of David Dungay. He was a First Nations man who died in a prison hospital. New South Wales is the only state or territory that has a hospital in a prison, and it's dysfunctional. Guards make or get involved in medical decisions, which was a disaster, which ended up killing David. But I just want to take up that point about the masks. We asked the guards in the inquest, you know, they all acknowledged that they put David face down and basically put pressure on him like George Floyd. And David was saying, I can't breathe, I can't breathe. All the medical experts say you should not restrain a person face down. They should be on their back. And when we asked the guards, you know, they've had retraining and an announcement, you know, a bulletin put out, you shouldn't hold someone face down. They gave evidence in the witness box 2 years after David died. If you had the chance to do it again, would you have done anything different? I'll sit there. Oh, because I feel better, I feel safer doing it that way. It's the same thing about the Spithoods. It's all about them. They don't mind taking the risk of someone's life as long as they're not at any risk at all. They just feel more comfortable.
But there were 5 guards.
6.
6 guards. And 1 man.
And he was begging for his life. And they didn't, and they knew that the proper way to handle him was on his back, but they felt more comfortable doing it that way. Which cases? I think the case that really moved me in this area and really made me focus, and the National Justice focus on healthcare, not just policing and guards. You know, we've been talking a lot about the way guards treat people, but doctors, nurses, midwives, they can also play a role in the unequal provision of healthcare. And Miss Doo's case, which was a Western Australian case where a young Aboriginal woman who'd been the victim of domestic violence happened to be arrested at the same time of her partner, who was the perpetrator of the domestic violence against her. So police came out to arrest him for being a perpetrator. He'd broken her rib. And they arrested her. Why? That's the first question. Why was she criminalised? She had an outstanding fine. And in Western Australia, at that time, and we did get this reform, the police had to arrest people who had not paid their fines if there was a warrant. So what we were doing there, once again, was what we as a society were doing, was criminalising poverty. A young woman can't afford to pay a fine. And imagine this in future too. The lesson from this case is, if you're a woman and you're the victim of domestic violence, and particularly an Aboriginal woman, and you've got an unpaid fine, don't call the police, because you'll get arrested. Right? So then the police bring her in to the lockup and interview her about her injuries in front of the perpetrator. So she is minimising them, her injuries in front of the perpetrator. When they finally separate them, she tells the police that she's really in pain, but they don't believe her, because she didn't tell them when she had the chance in front of the perpetrator. Imagine that. And then from that point on, that prejudice that she was faking to get out of her jailing for a fine default led to a belief in the police mind that she was faking. But to make matters worse, at some point someone looked at her and said, oh, maybe she is sick. They took her to the local hospital, and the police primed the nurses and the triage nurse with misinformation. She's faking. So everyone starts thinking she's faking. The doctors don't take her seriously. They touch her ribs and she's in excruciating pain. They don't do any tests. She's fine. They send her back. Halfway through the night, she's moaning and can't move. Once again, they take her to the hospital, and the doctors have formed this view, because she said that she'd taken drugs in the days or weeks before, that she was drug sick. And they didn't believe her. They sent her back again, and she passed away because she had an infection caused by the break in her ribs. And Miss Doo's case, what was interesting about it was that the police officers all admitted in the witness box that they had behaved in a cruel and inhumane way. It was really interesting. They had a lawyer, Steve was there too, who had obviously said, just agree, tell them the truth. And they said, look, you know, we did the wrong thing. The doctors and nurses, none of them accepted any responsibility for their role in it. They had not done their job properly. Their eyes were prejudiced. Of course, they've been primed by others, but that's no excuse. Their job is to keep an open mind and diagnose what the real problem is, and not just have a prejudiced eye. And we see this happen again and again. In fact, 2 weeks ago, we got contacted by a family in Dubbo in New South Wales, where a 36-year-old man, Aboriginal man, had turned up at Dubbo Hospital. He complained of a tearing or popping sound in his stomach. He had a ruptured ulcer. And but once again, he admitted he'd smoked cannabis. So they all assumed that it was cannabinoid hyperemesis. I've never even heard of this until these cases, actually. It's an assumption that's made regularly about Aboriginal patients. Cannabinoid hyperemesis is a form of nausea that you get if you have too much cannabis. I've never heard of it. But all the doctors and nurses assume that it's drug-induced, when in fact, this man was dying of a ruptured stomach ulcer. And it wasn't diagnosed, and he was sent home to die. But some good things came from Miss Doo's case. The doctors were actually charged by the health authorities for their failures. There was a custody notification scheme implemented in Western Australia. So every time a First Nations person is brought into custody, the Aboriginal Legal Service has to get notified. There's been law reform on fine defaults, so that fine defaulters are no longer arrested. And the family were apologised to and compensated by the West Australian government. So you can get change, it takes time. That took about 4 or 5 years for that to pass through the system, but it does happen. Naomi Williams' case, another case that we worked on for a 26-year-old pregnant Aboriginal woman who turned up 15 times at her local hospital. Once again, they assumed that it was a cannabinoid hyperemesis. She had a bad pregnancy, she was nauseous. Instead of assuming cannabis, you might have thought she was having a difficult pregnancy. She never got referred to an obstetrician, and on the last occasion she went home and died of septicemia after being turned away from the hospital. But we have got, the coroner made some profound recommendations about racism in healthcare, and just last week 2 Aboriginal elders, one of whom is a relative of Naomi, were appointed to the local area health board. The coroner recommended that Aboriginal people be appointed to local area health boards in proportion to their population. So if there's a big Aboriginal population, they should be represented on health boards. There should be employees at the hospital that reflect their community makeup. And those recommendations have started to be implemented. So we do get wins and we do see change.
And those wins are profound, Bob, because it's about what you're preventing from happening. The next generation in prisons, the next generation of Indigenous women fleeing DV or in pregnancies actually dying in one of the richest places on earth. George, I've got about 6 minutes before I have to hand over to the audience for questions. So I've got about a couple more I want to get through. Right now, what are the biggest priorities for the National Justice Project? For you and your team of lawyers, what are the areas that you want to see the most changing right now that you're facing into, and what are the challenges of taking that on?
Well, I think there's an intersection, obviously, with the work that Kon's doing. First of all, refugees. We have a cruel and inhumane system in law. You can actually see it in front of your eyes. This is government policy to inflict harm on people. When I talk about the unconscious bias of police and doctors and nurses, it's not in law that they should behave that way. But when you talk about asylum seekers, it's actually in law. We're going to lock people up indefinitely. We give the minister the power to, basically imprison them forever. These are very explicit laws, and they promote them overseas that way. Government sends messages over to Sri Lanka and the Middle East that if you come here, your life's going to be I lost my track.
Just right now, what are the couple of
top
priorities?
Top priorities. So that was the intersection. We'd like to see equity in healthcare, not equality, but equity in healthcare for all people, not just First Nations people. The work that we're doing there to change people's perceptions and biases, that applies to all culturally and linguistically diverse people. It also applies to the disabled. It also applies to the elderly. You go into an emergency department, if you're elderly, and you see you'll get different treatment from the average person on the bell curve. We want to see that kind of change. But over the next few years, with resources, we would also like to attack the high rate of First Nations child removals. They're growing at exponential rates. And also the issue, and this is often an intersectional issue, of disability, the discrimination against people with disabilities. We've been actively involved in the Royal Commission into the treatment of people with disabilities, both from a refugee perspective, also First Nations perspective, and in particular for the children, Aboriginal children who have intellectual disabilities who've been forced into the child protection system. And they also get no, in my view, care, which they should. And so these are 3 very important issues that I think we're going to be looking at over the next few years. And I hope we get to a stage, my hope is that we don't have to do this work anymore. That would be the best thing that could happen. If there were no more of these cases, if the system did its job properly, we wouldn't have to exist.
You've segued perfectly into my last question before I go to the audience, which is, how do we hold hope? Like, this has been a heavy conversation. Like, people are hearing this and going, "Whew, that's a lot to take in. That hurts hearing that." But I hope you're taking away the possibilities here. How do you hold hope?
Well, the great, people may not know this, but one of the very important things that the National Justice Project does is mentor and encourage the leaders of the future, the social justice lawyers and the social justice advocates of the future. We do a lot of work at universities. Steve there teaches at Monash and runs a clinic. I teach at Macquarie, and we have interns. And I think our children and young people are our hope. That's where I really see hope. They have a very different attitude from the dinosaurs that you see in Parliament. I'm not talking about any political party, just generally. They are concerned about our future, our world future, our climate future, but also they are more sensitive to the way that we treat other human beings. And I'm hoping that with the skills that we're teaching them, the young people that we're seeing, that they'll be able to go in and advocate for those who need it most. So I think we are seeing change slowly in our society, but the children are our future, and I just hope we can accelerate their attitudes across all society.
And I love the optimism. And even though we work closely together, even I'm sitting here absolutely inspired and awed by what you do, I want to turn to you to ask questions before going to Jane for closing remarks. The floor is open. What would people like to ask George?